in the last 4 years since 2020, so we're only 4 years into the current decade, we've already burned more than any previous decade in recorded history. We were around 4 million hectares burned. In the next season look like for BC, what we will often reference is where we've come from. For the BC context, we've been in several years of fairly extreme drought conditions,
Hmm.
and to highlight, how we're entering the 2024 season is that we've just gone through a winter with essentially the lowest snowpack levels on record for BC fire season.
Okay.
We could be on par or exceed all other sources of human emissions from that jurisdiction due to the wildfires. And so wildfires are it's kind of this feedback loop we're in.
Yes.
Wildfires are contributing emissions just as human sources of emissions are, but that is further exacerbating, the path we're on with respect to climate change. And
Hey everyone, Rupesh Patel here, host of the Two Nobodies podcast. Are you curious about the 2024 wildfire season? 2023 was a disaster across Canada. From East Coast to West Coast to Northern Canada, there were wildfires burning out of control. Smoke was blanketing the entire country. Smoke was going into the United States. Everyone was feeling it. It was depressing. I talked to Neal McLoughlin in this episode. He's from the BC Wildfire Services and is in charge of their predictive services team, essentially their forecasters. So we get into what 2024 is going to look like. We talk about what are the different factors that they consider when they're doing their forecasting. We talk about what are the emission impacts from all these wildfires and how does that compare to human emissions. We talk about the effects of climate change on wildfires. How are they managing wildfires going into this year compared to last year? What are the different changes that they're making? And finally, what are the innovative tools that they're starting to use, both from forecasting and predicting these wildfires to managing these wildfires? So if you're curious about wildfires in general, what's happening in Western Canada, climate change impacts, this is absolutely the episode for you. I can't wait to hear your comments. Like, subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the show. Cheers.
Welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast with my dad.
Neal, so good to have you on the Two Nobodies podcast. I've been looking forward to this episode for such a long time. Always wanted to learn more about how wildfire prediction happens. Certainly curious about the 2024 season. I'm sure many people are. And then just wildfire management and climate and its impacts and all that. So excited that, you've also, I think, worked in Alberta and now you're working in BC. So you kind of have the prairies and the west side sort of covered, but just really welcome you to Two Nobies podcast and appreciate you making time for me today.
yeah, hi Rupesh, thanks for the invite. Happy to chat with you about wildfire and some of my background today. So
Yeah, really look forward to it. Yeah, 2023 was quite the season. Hey, like I don't know. I know in Alberta, obviously, it was. I think it was one of the worst, but I don't know in BC if it was the same case. The last few years have just been seems like they've been horrific. From 2023, like what were those learnings, I guess, for you folks?
yeah, well, I mean, to set the context for last year, if we look at area burned in the province of BC
Yeah.
by decade, we have records going back to 1950. And in the last 4 years since 2020, so we're only 4 years into the current decade, we've already burned more than any previous decade in recorded history. We were around 4 million hectares burned in the province, and we came close to that in the previous decade, but that was 10 years combined. And so, if we were even to move forward into the next 6 years of this decade and just burn at a typical annual area burned, we're going to be in far exceedance of any previous decade on record. So a very, very noted fire season. And when you look at it across Canada, we're seeing similar statistics from multiple provinces and territories. So a very extreme fire season. And I think what's a key learning there is fire agencies across Canada rely on interagency collaboration and resource
Mm,
sharing to essentially respond effectively to these extreme fire seasons. And this is a year, 2023 was a year that, agencies across Canada have been worried about for a long time. For my 20-year career, it's the one we've been talking about and thought would never come. The year that all agencies across Canada were simultaneously busy and there were no resources to share. So yeah, a very challenging season to work through, not just only in my own jurisdiction of British Columbia, but across Canada.
Yeah, so you said, sorry, let's tap into that a little bit more. You said simultaneously last year, there was busyness across the board. Was that just because of the demand, or was there sort of a resource gap, or yeah, was it more of was it what was sort of the driver, I guess, for that lack of capacity?
Yeah, so if you look in each of the respective fire management agencies across Canada, they'll have staff that are trained to
Yeah.
respond to what we'll call emerging incidents that have escaped initial attack and now require dedicated resources to manage them through to extinguishment. And we call those teams incident management teams.
Mm,
Typically, an agency will have sufficient trained staff and resources to manage maybe two to a maximum of four of these large fire incidents at any given time. When you look at what happened last year, we had each province having multiple large fire incidents that exceeded their own in-house capacity. Now that's fine. The model in Canada of resource sharing, and the model actually extends into other countries as well. We'll bring in
hmm.
resources from the United States, Mexico, and other, New Zealand, Australia, around
South
the world.
Africa, I think,
But
right?
when you start in Canada and very quickly in the fire season, we were exceeding that incident management team capacity where
Mm,
we were having to call on our partners to help us with additional incidents that were emerging, and they couldn't release those resources because they had an elevated fire load happening within their own jurisdiction. So then we start looking to other countries around the world. And um, the second challenge with resource sharing is folks have to take time off. They have to rest, and
yeah.
they're working long, like 14 to 21 day deployments. When we bring international resources over, we'll bring them over for even longer periods of time, but they do need a rest period halfway through. And so you may have folks that are available, but you're also having to think about that time off period and how you stagger resources. And so, anyways, last year, due to those rapidly escalating wildfire situations in each of the provinces, we just exceeded capacity, and uh, and so you're in a situation where you're having to triage and prioritize what fires are going to get those specialized resources, and which fires you're essentially just going to monitor.
What do you think about our capacity from, like, aircrafts and other kind of tools that we have to fight these fires? Like, I think like our fleet of our aircraft are kind of getting on the older side. I know that I think there's a company maybe in Quebec or so, that designs new aircraft for wildfire management. And I don't know if it seems like we don't have really big contracts with this company, but it seems like, yeah, it seems like we're kind of low on resources from an aircraft perspective. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I will not profess to be an expert in aviation and fire,
Yeah.
although I do know a little bit about it. I think from my perspective, we often um, maybe exaggerate the role of aircraft.
Okay.
You look at some of the conditions last year where you have really smoky skies, unstable flying conditions or unsafe flying conditions, and uh, well, we might look at that from a general perspective and say, oh, why aren't we throwing
Mm,
air tankers or helicopters on that fire? We may actually not be able to, just from a safety perspective. It's unsafe work conditions, or the effectiveness of that aircraft in that situation may not actually provide any benefit. But I think to answer your question, there are other um, field activities during the fire season that do compete with access, particularly particularly to helicopters. So
Mm,
you've got a lot of forestry operations that are using helicopters, as well as oil and gas operations in
mm,
remote areas. And so one of the things that will happen in a busier season like last year is a lot of those other field activities will often get shut down just due to
mm-hmm.
the elevated fire danger and risk.
Yeah.
And then those aircraft do become more available for us to access and use in fighting fire. Um, so, I'll leave it there. I think there's, on the horizon, there's some interesting usage of remotely piloted or RPAS systems to help monitor fires. I'm starting to hear things like I'm living a science fiction movie about, the use of drones that can go seek out hotspots and deliver a retardant load.
Mm,
So, it we are where we're at, but I think there's some really interesting innovations that may help improve availability of aircraft systems to help fight fire. Um, I wouldn't say that in 2023 aircraft was necessarily the cause of
yeah.
the area burned or the outcomes.
Okay.
Certainly, at times there was shortages of helicopters or aircraft, and we did have to make strategic decisions on where to send them. But there were also even more times where it was just unsafe to fly, and where we may have liked to use aircraft, we couldn't. So.
Yeah. 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 In BC wildfires response to wildfires, what's your role in this whole picture?
Yeah, so I'm the superintendent of our predictive services program. I work out of our provincial headquarters in Kamloops, and really, I came to BC just 2 years ago, and um, essentially my role right now is in creating a new program. There have been many folks in the past in BC Wildfire Service that have been um, helping support aspects of predictive services, but
Mm,
following the 2017 and 2018, 2021 seasons in BC, there was a concerted effort to invest in a full-time predictive services program. And so really for the last 2 years, I've been hiring staff and establishing a new program. But going forward, our role is to provide real-time business intelligence to the organization to help support strategic decisions. So whether that be resourcing levels, it doesn't. It's not the snap of a finger that allows us to get resources in place. You have to order
mm,
them. You have to allow for transportation time. And so, seeing trends, seeing patterns around what the next week or two could look like, it could take
yeah.
that long to get resources in place. And so we need to be thinking ahead. Also helping with the current situation as we get multiple wildfire incidents occurring, helping to triage those incidents and provide an indication of where those fires are going,
Mm,
what they may impact in the coming days, and that can help inform more tactical decisions on how we respond to those fires. So, and I could go on when we kind of zoom out from fire seasons and start thinking ahead for the next 10 years. Where are the risks on the landscape? How can we start to work with other land managers to manage more broad scale wildfire risk and potential occurrence? Are there things that we can do to mitigate higher risk conditions across large landscapes? And how do we monitor that? How do we evaluate the effectiveness of our treatments in terms of reducing risk going forward? And so, that would be another application of predictive services, but it's focused more on the future and actions we can take to mitigate future fire seasons.
so what I'm hearing is the predictive services that you folks offer. There's various timelines. So there could be timelines like more, within the current week, or more real time kind of predictive services, to as far as like what the next 10, 15 years kind of look like. Is that sort of accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, we go from what's happening tomorrow, what's
Yeah.
happening next week, next
Yeah.
month,
Yeah.
all the way to the next decade kind of
Yeah.
thing. So, and in addition to the spatial, or sorry, the temporal timeframes, there's also different spatial contexts that we work in. And so we could think of what's happening on this particular fire, what's happening in this region, what's happening across this province, and what's happening nationally and internationally that could impact us. And we talked about that earlier with respect to
Mm,
resource availability, or it may not be availability for resources to come to our province, but we may be called upon to help other agencies as well. And
Yeah.
so we need to keep an eye on that as well. We do have international agreements in place. And one of the nice things with working with countries on the other side of the hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, on the other side of the globe, is that our fire seasons are offset. They're
Mm.
alternating, and so we can bring in staff from New Zealand, Australia when it's essentially their winter, and vice versa. And so keeping an eye on that kind of national and international situation is also important. So yeah, multiple time scales, multiple spatial scales that we need to think on, which makes the job challenging, but also really interesting.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Neil, do you mind tilting your camera a little bit down just so I can fully get you in the? That'd be
how's
good.
that?
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay, so when you think about 2024, I'm sure folks are really interested in what this season looks like. When you think about a season, I imagine it's probably restarted. I mean, I looked at Alberta's wildfire dashboard. We already have almost 50 wildfires, nothing out of control. But I tried to look at BC Wildfire Service. I couldn't find a number, so I don't know where you folks are at. But I know wildfire season's already started. So um, but I know folks are probably starting to get interested in like what's going to happen over these summer months. Walk folks through what you're seeing as far as the 2024 season is concerned.
Yeah, well, I mean, to set the context, we typically issue a seasonal outlook
Okay.
to talk about, spring, summer, fall conditions. We'll typically release our seasonal outlook for spring in April, early April.
Okay.
We were being asked to issue our spring outlook in January,
Okay. Okay.
and I think, by late February, early March, we'd already released our first spring outlook. And
Mm,
so, um, what does the next season look like for BC? What we will often reference is where we've come from. And for the BC context, we've been in several years of fairly extreme drought conditions.
mm-hmm.
And to highlight, how we're entering the 2024 season is that we've just gone through a winter with essentially the lowest snowpack levels on record for
Yeah.
BC. So we'll often look to that overwinter precipitation to help recharge fuel moisture and at least set us up in lower fire danger conditions in the early spring. That hasn't been the case this year. So we ended last year with high drought levels throughout the province. And when I say drought, there's often kind of two ways of thinking about that. One is like availability of water for, drinking and watering your plants and what's in the
Yeah.
water bodies. That's kind of the more traditional thinking around drought. When we talk about drought and fire, we're actually talking about the availability of fuels to burn,
Mm,
and at higher drought levels, all fuels are available to burn. And so, lower levels, you just see that more your fine fuels that would be burning. But at higher drought levels, you're going to see deep soil layers and large fuels available to burn, which is problematic because it means a fire can release more energy and it's more challenging to control and put out. And so, that sets the stage for how we're starting this season. Is we've got these elevated drought levels, fuels are available to burn, and when
mm-hmm.
we look at the outlook in terms of weather, I mean, we've just set a 10th month in a row record for hottest temperatures around the globe.
Mm-hmm.
Our outlook for temperatures going into at least the first half of the fire season are again elevated above
Yeah.
normal. And precipitation is always a challenge to forecast. That's going to kind of make the difference. But uh, we would typically see the spring months, at least in the interior of the province, being the wettest months of the year. And so far, the outlooks are not great. Looking at below normal precipitation, and we're not really seeing any change in that pattern going forward. I think the silver lining in it for the 2024 season is that we are exiting a back-to-back double year El Nino.
Mm-hmm.
El Nino is where you've got
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
yeah, you've got it. It's essentially it's got to do with ocean temperatures, and so and specifically in the Pacific Ocean. And so in a hotter year in Canada, that would be where ocean temperatures in the Pacific are warm off the Pacific coast of British Columbia, and influences atmospheric temperatures over the Western prairies. And so we've just gone through, like I say, a back-to-back El Nino, which has brought, in addition to climate change impacts, even more elevated temperatures just due to that
Mm-hmm.
that oscillation. We're now exiting that, and we may
Mm-hmm.
go into a neutral phase or even a La Nina phase, which is where we go into a more cooler, wetter climate pattern, which is great. We're we're really hoping for that, but we're not seeing that really come into effect until late in the fire season, maybe the fall or into the early winter months. And so,
Okay.
if I were to paint a picture for the fire season ahead, it's going to be busy. We're probably going to see extreme fire again. We could probably expect to see some communities threatened by fire and have evacuations or restrictions in place throughout the province. And we're probably going to see smoky skies again for
Yeah.
portions of the summer. So we're rapidly getting prepared for another busy fire season.
Goodness. Are there certain parts of BC that are more concerning to you than others?
Uh, for sure, yeah. I mean, really, we do have drought conditions throughout the province, but we did have a couple smaller regions, particularly our coastal regions and the southeast corner of the province did get decent recovery with fall precipitation.
Mm-hmm.
But really, what I've got my eye on right now is the northern half of the province. We carried close to 100 holdover fires, and a holdover fire is where you've got a fire burning last year, and it continues to burn through the winter, and it can show back up in the subsequent year. Um, Not atypical to have holdover fires in the north. You've got deep organic soils that can smolder away under the snowpack through the year. This is a very common thing, but just the sheer number of holdover fires is concerning.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really keeping an eye on our northern fire centers to ensure that if those holdover fires start to show up in the early spring months, that we've got a strategic approach to start putting out holdover fire activity that could be of concern to values at risk and surrounding communities. So, you know, concern for that reason, also concern just for the elevated drought they're carrying, and it extends beyond northern BC into Yukon and into the Northwest Territories, where we saw some very alarming fire activity
Yes.
last year. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That was that unusual, would you say? Like what was happening in the north?
Uh, I mean, large fire activity is not atypical for the North,
Mm-hmm.
but uh, the extreme fire behavior that went with it it was an indication of just the drought conditions and the climate change effects that we're seeing.
Yeah.
I think what was a shock for Northwest Territories in particular was the degree to which the large communities were impacted and evacuated for over a month, and roads were cut off. I mean, it really just it severed Northwest Territories from the
Yeah.
rest of Canada,
Yeah.
and really shut down communities for most of the summer. I mean, uh, that is that hasn't really happened to that scale ever in my history working in fires. So certainly the human impacts of these large fire seasons are starting to be much more noticeable and experienced more broadly than ever in the past.
Wasn't Yellowknife like I think Yellowknife was threatened, right? Like they pretty much almost evacuated most of Yellowknife. Like
Yeah,
quite, yeah.
yeah.
You were talking about some of the. You're talking. Maybe help me understand. You were talking about fuels, and you said that with higher drought conditions, they kind of accesses deeper fuels, and maybe just help us understand what you mean by these different types of fuels.
Yeah. If I were to talk about a fine fuel, let's think about like grasses or needles,
Okay.
very small twigs. They're
Yeah.
they're they're smaller than your finger. They're even smaller diameter than a pen.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
we start to think about medium-sized fuels, we're starting to think about things the size of your finger to maybe the size of your wrist. And then if we think about and also just shallow organic matter in the forest floor. If
Okay.
we think about large or coarse fuels, we're starting to think about things, the size of your arm to the size of your leg or larger
Mm.
in terms of,
Okay.
woody debris or really deep organic material that a fire would have to kind of burn down to access. And the importance of distinguishing these three size classes is they all have different lag times in terms of responding to changes in weather and moisture.
Mm,
And so a fine fuel can change very rapidly. You can go from a high moisture content and to a dry fine fuel within a day and a half. And we monitor changes in fine fuel moisture on an hour to hour basis because it's
mm,
very responsive to changes in the atmosphere and the weather. Whereas as you get into the more medium and coarse size fuels, they have a longer lag time. Medium fuels are usually around a week to a week and a half. And when you get into those large fuels, we're talking like 52 days, like over a month in terms of their response time. And so why that's important is when you dry coarse fuels out to the degree that they are across most of Western Canada right now, and really all of Canada, it takes time to build moisture back up. It doesn't just happen with one rain event. So uh, my team members have been looking at that, like what would it take to turn this around for the fire season ahead? What do we need for
mm,
precipitation? And we're really talking like 40 to 60 millimeters of rain for 2 weeks straight, like just constant steady rains, and just those really penetrating rains that
yeah.
soak in. And without that, we can change the moisture content of those fine and medium fuels on the surface, but they'll dry out quickly. Within a day or a week, they'll be dried out again if we get hot weather. Underlying all of that, those coarse fuels will remain dry unless we get substantive rainfall. And so um, we can carry these drought conditions for quite a long time until we get a anomalous rain event, essentially.
Mhm. So what I'm hearing is like if you're seeing okay, there's upcoming precipitation, people just start to get some hope. It's like okay, the rain's coming, but it really depends on sort of what level of fuel has been burnt, right? So what I'm hearing is that if it's those larger courses of fuel that's been burnt, a rainfall over the weekend, it might help a little bit, but it's probably not going to be the saving grace. Is sort of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's exactly right,
Yeah,
Rapusha. It's, we'll take rain, we'll take any amount we can get.
yeah,
A light rain one day will give us an advantage. It will subdue fire behavior for the next day or two. It will allow us to get ahead of the fire and secure some line, but it certainly doesn't change the underlying conditions. And so, um, to start calling the next fire season, lower fire danger, and we're not expecting a lot to happen, we need to see those kind of rainfall events, in the next month or two. And if we don't, it's setting a course for another busy year.
yeah. Okay, so you have all this information and thoughts about what your predictions for the 2024 season. How does that get used by the folks on who are actually managing these wildfires? Is that taken fully to heart, or are they kind of what are they doing operationally? I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of different ways it gets used. Everything from like setting operational budgets.
Hmm.
We're through the winter, we're hiring staff and planning what are we going to need to prepare for
Mm,
the next fire season. So it informs a lot of those preparations, and um, then you can start to shift into the fire season. A lot of our staff are keenly aware of the conditions, so I'm not
yep.
saying anything new to what they're seeing in their respective regions that they work, but safety is a really big one, and so that's something that we've emphasized this spring. Is um, when you go through fire seasons uh, and you start to make decisions going forward, that this would happen in many other fields. You kind of have a playbook. I've seen this before, or yeah, last year this is what it was like in the spring, and then I remember
Yeah.
what happened in the summer and the fall, and you start to refer to your experience in terms of inferring what's going to happen going forward. And when we get into these years where we're experiencing anomalous conditions, sometimes you don't have that playbook to go and rely upon, or your experience can be a bit misleading, and firefighters could get themselves into tricky situations. So we've really been emphasizing safety coming into this fire season, and that we may be experiencing more extreme fire behavior early in the season than what we would typically expect. And we may need to take extra precaution to ensure safety of our field staff, um, compared to what we otherwise would. In
Hmm.
addition, if we're doing any early season operations, it may take more effort to, if we're conducting, say, a prescribed fire. to reduce fuels in an area, it may take more effort to ensure that that fire is out than a typical year. And so, really emphasizing the safety aspect. Also, just like the pace, burnout
Hmm.
is a very real thing in wildfire management agencies. We're working long days for months on end, and
Yeah.
so really just setting that pace out of the gate. And so, I mentioned holdover fires in the north earlier. Um, we could be scrambling to get every single holdover fire out right now, but we
Hmm.
also have to think about pace. Like, we're in this for the next several months,
Yeah.
and so there's a really important aspect around worker health, mental health, burnout, and so, yeah, it's used in a variety of ways. And then as we start to see fire activity, it's going to start to inform resourcing levels, preparedness levels, and prioritization of fires. And so it just kind of starts to cascade. So it's, predictive services, business intelligence. It's used in a variety of ways, but
Hmm.
I would say right now it's really kind of setting that stage and really helping folks to uh, come into the fire season aware of the conditions they might be seeing and experiencing, and doing that in a safe manner. Um, and also kind of recognizing, as you asked earlier, like, where are the higher risk areas in the
Yeah.
province? Where should we be concerned?
Your point about like the holdover fires is actually that thought crossed my mind is like, why not, put a bunch of resources to try to address those right now? I imagine you folks probably also get pressure from the public, especially in those communities, to be like, why don't we, focus in those areas? So it's probably a hard thing to balance, hey? Like, balancing the the burnout risk that you're talking about with, yeah, maybe we could put some extra resources there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that maybe I can provide some insight on is, we don't just fight fire. We are also trainers. Like,
Mm.
every year, most of our firefighters are seasonal employees. We're hiring
Hmm.
folks back, or we're hiring in new summer students to work with our program. And these folks need training. They need to be
Hmm.
certified to do the jobs that they're doing. And uh, you know, people like myself throughout the organization are the people that provide that training.
Yeah.
And so, um, why aren't we doing anything early spring? Well, we're hiring all of our firefighters. We're training them. We're
Yeah.
ensuring they know how to do their jobs effectively. I recall last season, we were starting to have a lot of large fires kick off in the northern portions of the province, and we're still holding our boot camps and training
Hmm.
staff because they've just finished school.
Yeah.
You can't get them any earlier. They just finished school, and we're putting them through their courses and training. And so it's a really key thing is, we rely heavily on a seasonal workforce. One of the changes going forward in BC, at least, is that we are starting to move a portion of that workforce to more permanent positions, so that you've got
Hmm.
the notion of a year-round firefighter. And so you'll have at least like a base level of resources that are available early in the season. But it's where we're at right now. We uh,
Yeah.
we we rely heavily on a seasonal workforce, and there's a lot of moving pieces early in the season to get the overall operation up and running.
Is there a supply there for the workforce? Like, are folks interested to pursue these positions, or is it hard to find folks to fill these roles?
Well, we at least here in BC, we've had really good success going into the 2024 fire season. But
Okay.
what I'll say from my career is, at times we do compete with other activities on the land base. And so, as an example, if oil and gas is offering similar field work positions, but it pays better,
Mm.
it can be challenging to attract folks into our jobs.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
uh, it's a really interesting line of work. Um, you're working these long hours. It does take some dedication, and it takes a real passion to be working in adverse conditions.
Yeah.
But you often come away from it with really strong connections to your colleagues and some really wild experiences that kind of last with you. And so we often refer to it as catching the fire bug. And so folks come in, and they get hooked, and they want to come back. And so,
Yeah.
really fortunate to be seeing a lot of returning firefighters, a lot of returning crew members, which helps. It lessens the load on terms of how much training you have to do in the season, and it also allows those folks to share their knowledge from previous fire seasons with new colleagues that they're working with. So. Yeah, at least right now we're doing really well, and looking forward to seeing some more permanent positions come into effect as well, where we can, just support that early season or late fall activity when a lot of our staff go back to school or other things.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I know you're focused mostly on BC, but what are you noticing from other areas like Alberta and maybe other parts of the country?
Oh, what am I noticing? Well, I just came from Alberta 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So I'm often looking over the fence because it's
Hmm.
where my roots were from. And, what I'll say is wildfire agencies are often within larger government organizations,
Hmm.
and politics play a big role, and government cutbacks and budgets, economy really impacts. And so, I'm looking across the border at Alberta, and they're suffering right now from recent cutbacks. And
Mm.
despite everything we've talked about, climate change and escalating extreme fire seasons,
Yeah.
they're having to do more with less. That just plain and simple as that, and that's really hard to watch. I talked about burnout. That's even more of a thing for agencies that are constrained in terms of resource capacity.
Yeah.
Also hard to attract talent when there's cutbacks or not as much emphasis on a program. So that's hard to see. Uh, but
Why
across,
do you think like this? Like, why do you think? I understand, like, obviously the climate piece could be a political issue, but just wildfire management, like, why do you think that is a political issue? Like, there's a need. Clearly, in Alberta, it was a record fire season last year. Like, I don't know. That part doesn't make sense to me. Like, why wouldn't we put resources towards this?
yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of Alberta politics, but I
Yeah.
think one of the important things is wildfire response, wildfire management is a very expensive, uh, you know,
Mm,
operation. Putting air tankers and helicopters in the sky day after day, hiring thousands of firefighters, running those operations, 24/7 through the season. It's expensive. It's a very expensive program in government, and if you know provincial economics don't
mm-hmm,
support a budget within government that can
mm-hmm.
pay for those services essentially.
Yeah.
I've been through it. I've been in government for 20 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
Cutbacks are a real thing as a public
Mm-hmm.
servant, and many of us have gone through it. And so
Yeah.
other programs in government will see cutbacks, but fire will as well. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the challenge is when you superimpose that on a changing climate and escalating fire seasons. Um, yeah, we are at times being asked to do more with less. And so,
Yeah.
regardless of the political stance that a particular agency has or a particular government has, I think those are just some realities of
Yeah.
working within government.
Yeah. Do you see the same factors that you spoke of in BC from high drought risk and some of those key factors in Alberta or in other parts of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at the conditions across the country, and I would say Western Canada does not look good going into
Okay.
2024, and right up into the Northwest Territories still. Um, yeah, I think it could be another busy year for all of Canada, in fact.
Yeah. Yeah. Is the Pacific Northwest of the United States, do they experience similar factors as BC and the prairies?
They do, but they're closer to the ocean, and
Mm,
so interesting. In BC, we'll look to what's happening across Canada because we've got these resource sharing agreements
yeah.
in place,
Yeah.
but we also look south because our counterparts in the United States along the Pacific coast share that Pacific Ocean influence similar to us, and so often are maybe similar in terms of fire regime. Um, the really interesting thing that we've observed is California has just come out of like a 10-year drought. If you've been seeing the news, like they've just
Yeah.
been getting hammered with rain,
Yeah.
and really they're on the other end of the spectrum now. But in talking to some of the experts from California, they just said, watch out the things that we've gone through. you might not see for another 10 years, but we're expecting that BC will see something similar, and here we are. Now we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
there are some commonalities as you look down into the Pacific Northwest. And we also do exchange information throughout the fire season and resources. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we're not just looking across Canada. We're looking south into the United States as well.
With that record rainfall in the in California in particular, I heard that there was one of their main sources of water, this lake. I
Yeah,
forget the name of the lake. It's like a 100-year record level highs. Like it's going to bring back a whole economic industry, and it's going to supply California with enough water, and it's crazy. Are they? I guess their fire season. Do you have any sense of if the risks are a little bit lower this year because of that record rainfall?
yeah. I haven't looked at the risk levels going into this interview, so I can't say. But given the rain that they've had, I don't think they're looking at an extreme season like we are here
Yeah.
in Canada.
Yeah.
I would say the tables have been flipped a bit, and
Yeah.
the attention will probably be on Canada again this year.
Yeah.
But certainly, one of the interesting things in California, particularly, is they'll often get some pretty elevated fire danger later in the fall with the Santa Ana winds coming
Okay.
off the ocean and really dry conditions setting up late in the season. And so it's not to say they couldn't get really busy later this year,
Mhm.
but good to see some of our counterparts getting some rain because it means
Yeah.
their resources might be available to come and help us this year.
Yeah, 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 for sure. What kind of future tools are you either leveraging right now or looking to leverage? Like I've looked into, AI could potentially is and starting to play a role. I know in the United States, I think there's some big tech firms who are getting involved in this. But yeah, are there tools like AI that you're starting to leverage or looking to leverage in the future from a predictive services standpoint?
Yeah, so in any given busy fire season, there's typically reviews that happen, and we did have a Premier's Task Force review the 2023 season here in BC, and they just released a number of recommendations.
Hmm.
One of them that's actually at the top of the list is to enhance predictive services and explore the use of technologies like artificial intelligence. And so,
Yeah.
you know, to answer your question, yeah, we are pursuing the use of technology to help do our work. Um, I've been in predictive services for 20 years, and I would
Okay.
say when I started, to be honest, we were using field guides and slide rules to make
Okay.
predictions, and that's
Yep.
how I was trained.
Yep.
Um, Kind of midway through my career, we started to introduce models that
Okay.
you would run on a computer
Yep.
and started to get more digitized, if you will.
Yep.
And where we're at right now, we're starting to look at opportunities to enhance those kind of modeling systems and predictive systems. And so there are a number of examples right now where you can see AI used in wildfire applications. I would say more predominantly in weather prediction, so improving
Mhm.
weather prediction, um, using it to characterize fuels and enhance the interpretation of remote sensing data, which is really fascinating. Um, we're exploring its use for enhancing fire behavior prediction.
Mhm.
I would say um, there are some challenges to using these technologies, though.
Mm.
So, you know, Chat GPT and some of these chat bots that are out there now, or you can go onto the internet and use AI to generate a video or a
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah.
We're starting to see it in you know, more available to the public, but what we often maybe don't understand is to train things like machine learning or artificial intelligence to get useful predictions or useful outputs. You need large volumes of data.
Mm.
And so when we think about chatbot tools or we think about generation of images, there
Mhm.
is endless amounts of data on the
100%.
internet
Yeah.
that these
Yeah.
tools can be trained on. When we start talking about wildfire, you know, typically in BC, we might get around 1,200 fires a year,
Yeah.
and similar for provinces the same size as ours across Canada.
Yeah.
But when you look at the actual data that we collect off of those fires that could be used to train a predictive model or system, it's
Mhm.
often quite limited. And
Mm.
um, and so that's the big challenge. And so what I would like to see, in my own opinion, in terms of using these technologies, I'm really excited about the use of, say, drone technology or remotely piloted aircraft systems that have sensors that can collect real-time information about fires
Mm-hmm.
so that we can start to put together large databases of information that down the road could be used to train these tools more effectively.
Yeah.
It's that old adage, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
We're actually not even there right now. We hardly have any kind of robust information to train these models on for certain applications for
Yeah.
you know so I think there's a lot of potential there, but I think the current focus has to be on really refining and enhancing the collection of data real time,
Mm-hmm.
so that it's available to train these tools more effectively. So I think there's some promise there. Um, are we pursuing it? Yeah, absolutely. There's some neat things. Just this last year, we were looking at ways we can use remote sensing information that tracks date of burning for ongoing fires,
Mm-hmm.
and using that to inform new equations and new predictions for a rate of spread
Mm-hmm.
under given conditions in the forest. And so, yeah, already starting to see some neat applications, but it needs some time
Yeah.
to refine it before it's useful.
Are drones being used right now, or is that sort of still a future state?
Drones are being used.
Okay.
We'll use them to do smaller ignition operations on a
What does that mean?
prescribed fire. Uh, where you would historically have seen it is we will attach essentially a large barrel of fuel with an ignition device attached to
Mm-hmm.
it underneath a helicopter.
Okay.
Or we'll have we call it ping pong machine or AED. It essentially has these little ping pong balls that are full of potassium permanganate, and it
Okay.
injects another chemical into it, and it basically starts to combust. And so you can also kind of imagine a little ping pong gun shooting out these combustible
Got it.
little ping pong balls. So there's two different measures, but typically in a helicopter, and we'll use that either to ignite areas in the forest if we're doing a prescribed fire operation and it's
Mm-hmm.
not safe to ignite it from the ground.
Yep.
We'll also use it to fight fire. So we can fight fire with fire by removing fuels ahead of a fire front,
Mm-hmm.
and so we can get out ahead of a fire and burn out an area using those typically aircraft operations. But for smaller prescribed fires, we're now able to do that with drones. We can
Okay.
attach smaller examples of that to a drone and ignite areas using drone technology. We are also able to use drones to scan fires for hotspots and
Mm.
to scan the fire perimeter to update maps. Right now, I would say the technology is limited in that it has to be within like line of sight where the
Mm-hmm.
drone is operated. And so it's typically smaller applications,
Mm.
but we are using drones in the wildfire space now. I think going forward, you could start to imagine drones that can go beyond line of sight and could be used to go fly missions overnight to update the boundary of fires or to
Yep.
monitor fires. You could imagine you get a band of lightning move across the province and you've got high fire danger.
Mm-hmm.
You might be able to selectively send that drone to uh, ignition, potential ignition locations where you have lightning strikes occurring in high fire danger areas, and maybe quickly detect if you've got a holdover fire from a lightning source or not. So, I think there's a lot of promise going forward, but right now we tend to just use it within these line of sight, smaller scale applications.
With AI, you said that the volume of data is really important. Uh, Can you leverage data from other jurisdictions? Like, would that be useful in a BC's context? Like, if you think about, like, if you said AI could maybe help with wildfire behavior predictions or that sort of thing, is there consistency with other jurisdictions in leveraging their data to build out that larger data volume and data set in any way, or it's not apples to apples sort of thing?
In some circumstances, yes, absolutely. One of the, I think, things that I would highlight that is maybe a barrier to doing that sometimes is the underlying vegetation, the forest
Mm-hmm.
ecosystems will
Mm-hmm.
shape how fire shows up,
Okay.
and it will shape fire behavior. And so one of the current systems that we use for predicting fire behavior, it's part of the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System, and specifically the Fire Behavior Prediction System, or at what we
Mm-hmm.
call the FBP system. Um, it was developed back in the 80s and early 90s. It was published, and it was based predominantly on boreal forest ecosystems. And so
Mm-hmm.
things like jack and lodgepole pine, black spruce, aspen mixed wood forests, etc. And so we do have those ecosystems in BC, but we also have a lot of unique ecosystems on the coast and in the
Mm-hmm.
interior that aren't represented in that system. And so, we can use information from other parts of Canada to help us refine our tools in the north, where we have those fuel types in common, or those forest types in common. But as we move into other parts of the province, that's where it becomes challenging to share information, and that we know fire responds differently in those ecosystems, and it's hard to find them across Canada.
Yeah.
We've got some very unique geography and unique ecosystems here in the province of BC. So in some circumstances, yes, we can share data, and in others,
Yeah.
we do have to collect it within our own jurisdictions to create the best predictive systems for those situations.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like AI could be a promising tool going forward. I guess from your end though, there's no resistance like from a because sometimes ideas come up, but within the people who are having to apply these things, it could be a bit of a culture change, or like you said, you were trained a certain way, and there's been evolutions in the tools that you've had. I'm not hearing necessarily resistance from your end or from your team's end to maybe even adopt this kind of technology.
No, it's there though. That's a really good noticing, Rupesh. It's going to bring change, and
Yeah,
people can be scared of change,
yeah,
particularly if you've invested the last 10, 20 years of your career in doing a certain thing, and
yeah.
following certain processes, and all of a sudden they're going to change. It brings uncertainty. It's like, what does the
100%.
rest of my career look like? So
Yeah.
I you know absolutely, there is resistance from that perspective, but we're embracing that, because I think at the end of the day, we are being forced to change regardless. And the way I'll kind of, frame that up is, last year, we were asked to produce predictive services and predictions on hundreds of wildfires in the province.
Mhm.
When I historically would do that on my computer, running models manually, it would take about 4 to 6 hours to
Yeah.
do one prediction well.
Yep.
You do the math on 400 fires. I
Yep.
didn't have enough time last year, nor
No.
did my colleagues, to
Yep.
effectively keep up. And so I think one of the biggest things that I see in using technology, I view it as a tool. It's a tool to help enhance our ability to do the work that we do.
Yep.
And with changing climates, with these busier fire seasons, the fire load far surpasses our ability to keep up. And so that's, in my opinion, what computers are really useful for, is they can help lighten the load. They can help us move information quickly, make it more accessible. And whether that's using AI, or whether that's just using more traditional statistical methods, or modeling methods,
Mhm.
it really doesn't matter to me. I think there's a real need to leverage technology to keep pace with these very busy fire seasons.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's great. I think that's a great way of putting it together. I want to maybe just shift to some of the causes of wildfires. So first, definitely want to talk on the climate side, but typically when wildfires are kind of getting started up, are they largely just natural causes, or is it can some of them really be human induced? Like, what's that balance look like from what you've seen over the years?
Yeah. Well, any source of heat can cause a fire,
Yeah.
uh, and I'll touch on that later. But in BC, most of our wildfires are caused by lightning. If you were to kind
Okay.
of, percentage wise, you're probably between 70 and 80% of all
Wow.
fires are caused by lightning,
Yeah.
and that's very common across the boreal forest,
Mm.
which ranges right across Canada. Um, for the remaining 20 to 30%, we'll call those human caused. Now, when we start to unpackage, like what is a human caused fire, it can be a lot of different things. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily mean a person is out there with a match. It could be a power line and a tree falls on a power line and arcs and you get a
Mm-hmm.
fire. It could be a vehicle crashes in the ditch and some grass gets on a hot engine block and starts
Yeah.
a fire. It could be equipment failure in a forestry operation. It could be an abandoned campfire. It could be an ATV or a motorbike with a hot muffler that gets some vegetation on it, and that vegetation catches on fire, falls off, and leaves a fire behind it. It could be arson. It could be a person intentionally lighting a fire.
Mm-hmm.
On and on and on. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of nuance to human caused fire. Um, but it's a much more predictable source of fire in that we typically see human caused fires concentrated around roadways and population centers, usually within about 20 kilometers. And there's a real seasonal component. We'll often see a pulse of human caused fires in the early spring. People are itching to get outside. All of
Mm-hmm.
our vegetation is still cured. You know, the grass is yellow, it's dry. The
Mm-hmm.
snow is just melted, but nothing's greened up yet.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
often have very dry air masses, windy conditions in the spring, but people are excited to get out in the warm weather
Yeah.
and recreate. And as that human activity starts to ramp up, that's where we'll start to see, a little bit of a spike in human-caused fires in early spring. But for the most part, if you look across the fire season, it's a fairly like stable level of like per month, month on
Okay.
month to month. It's like there's this background human ignition signal that's fairly consistent, but for at least for BC, when we get into July and August, that's where we really ramp up, where we start to see those big weather systems moving through the province, bringing in that lightning load. For other jurisdictions, I worked in Alberta a lot. May is a really tricky month in Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
and they do see a lot of human ignitions for the same reasons I just described.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also the month where they get the most problematic fire weather and conditions setting up. But you'll often see a bit of in other jurisdictions like Alberta, you see a bit of a bimodal where you'll get a spike in fire activity in the spring and then a subsequent spike later in the fall or late summer, fall, when you start to get these lightning systems bringing additional starts, but more in remote areas than the human
Yeah.
caused fires where they're closer to roads and population centers. So there's that. I'll say one more thing. Like I said, any heat source can cause a fire. There are instances of like hay bales catching fire. And
Oh,
that can just be like the sun shining down
jeez.
uh, on a hay bale, and it's
Yeah.
moist inside, and it starts to self combust.
Mm.
That's even possible. So
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah, any heat source can cause a fire.
Yeah. Um, Last year, I think didn't BC introduce fines for if they ever caught somebody, igniting a fire or something. Am I wrong about that?
Oh, I am not well versed in some of
Yeah.
the legislative measures, but we did have for most of the later half of the season restrictions in place throughout the province.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Restrictions on campfires, restrictions on, we actually categorize different sizes of fires. So everything from a campfire to like if you're burning a pile of debris, or doing a larger like industrial application where you've got larger amounts of fuel that need to be burned. And at parts of the fire season, we had restrictions on all of those different classes of
Mm-hmm.
burning activities. Um, and you know, for sure, with arson or human caused fire that's intentional, there are legislative measures to investigate and follow up on that with penalties or fines.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
in that world, so I couldn't like
No,
give you
that's
the
okay.
specifics, but yeah, absolutely. We actually have a team of investigators that's their focus all the
Okay.
time is looking at the cause of fires and investigating ones that are of concern.
Yeah. When it comes to climate, what do you want people to take away when in terms of climate impacts to wildfires? Um, because there's going to be people talk about debate things, but what's for you? What's the takeaways you want people to have when it comes to thinking about climate and its interaction with wildfires?
Yeah, well, I mean, for a lot of my career, as you're probably aware, like climate change was something we debated. Is it happening? Is it not?
Right. Yeah.
I think now it's fairly accepted that yeah, it's here.
Yeah.
The scientists were right, and if anything, it's happening faster than what we expected.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I would share with respect to fire is that we are also seeing extreme fire behavior at scales that we have never experienced in our living careers. And
Mm-hmm.
um, fire agencies are going to have to adapt to that, but to effectively, I think, deal with the changing fire regimes, the changing fire loads that climate change is going to bring, it's not just going to be the fire agencies that are going to solve this. And so,
Mm-hmm.
one of the recommendations and measures with the Premier's Task Force recommendations that were just released here in BC is to start to include local municipal fire sources in firefighting efforts. Whatever resource is first on scene for a new fire start, like put it out. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
wait for the
Mm-hmm.
BC Wildfire Service to show up. And so, there's that aspect of it is just fighting these fires is going to take
Yeah.
a societal effort, but it goes much beyond that. It's thinking about how are we using the landscape? What are our priorities?
Mm-hmm.
Forestry has been in the news a lot lately, and we've got this model of trying to grow as many trees as we can to harvest the largest yield of timber
Mm-hmm.
from a forest industry perspective, but highly dense stands of coniferous forests, particularly when they start to get drought stressed or impacted by insect and disease, which also comes with climate change, are
Mm-hmm.
highly volatile to fire. And so there's a balance for that, right? How do we use our landscapes? And so that goes well outside of fire agencies. That's, a societal and an economic consideration of how do we use forested landscapes going forward and balance the risk that they can pose to society versus the benefit they can bring from an ecosystem perspective, from an economic perspective, etc. So there's that component I would really highlight for folks to think about. And then just locally, I think it is more and more likely that people in communities or in rural areas are going to be impacted by fire either directly or indirectly. And so, you know, for as long as I've been working in fire, we've had a fire smart program
Mm-hmm.
in agencies across Canada. There's actually a Fire Smart Canada agency that promotes best practices. And there are things that people can do within their own backyards and just in their own preparations. So, you know, a clean backyard is a safe backyard from the perspective of fire. Uh, Knowing what to do if a fire approaches your community, like, are you prepared to evacuate? Um, even myself as a fire expert,
Yeah.
last year we had a fire south of Kamloops, and the column on that fire was raining ash and needles on my deck here in Kamloops. And I had a conversation that night with my family, like, we may need to evacuate. What are you going to take? And so even ourselves really hadn't prepared up until that point, and so started to kind of put together those sentimental possessions that we really want to make sure we had, making sure you have like your driver's license and your banking information,
Yeah.
and all of those things that can be taken for granted when you're having to leave in a quick hurry. And so, there's things you can do that, and then there's things that can happen at a community scale. And so um, mock disasters are a great thing that can maybe help you prepare. It's like
Mm.
we had one happen last fall in Kamloops where it's like they opened up the evacuation roads, and there was a day where you could practice driving out through those routes and experience what that would feel like, what that would look like. And so, there's a number of things we can do at all different scales. But I think the key message I have here, Rupesh, is it's going to take an all society approach. There are
Mm-hmm.
things that fire agencies are focused on and will continue to do, but the scale of the seasons we're going to see going forward are really going to require some substantive changes across all of society and just how we view and live in our forests.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we know the emissions coming out of these wildfires? Do we have a sense of that? because I don't know, you just imagine the amount of mitigation efforts that we're trying to do these days probably completely gets overwhelmed by these wildfires and the emissions coming out of them. Any sense or comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in mitigating future climate change, there's a keen focus on reducing emissions. And we
Yeah,
do, I wouldn't say we measure it precisely, but we can approximate. And the emissions due to wildfires in recent years is actually on par or exceeding human sources of emissions. And so, um,
over how much time? Like, what do you mean by that?
over a fire season,
Oh, okay,
we
okay.
could be on par or exceed all other sources of human emissions from that jurisdiction due to the wildfires. And so wildfires are it's kind of this feedback loop we're in. Wildfires are
Yes.
contributing emissions just as human sources of emissions are, but that is further exacerbating the path we're on with respect to climate change. And so you know going forward, there's going to be an increased emphasis to control fire or to
Mhm.
reduce emissions due to fire for those reasons. But yeah, it's really problematic in that we're kind of caught in this positive feedback loop.
This loop, obviously we live in a global world, but are there any sort of are these loops kind of do they stay in any way in a particular area, if that makes sense? So if there's heightened wildfires, heightened emissions in Western Canada, can we repeatedly see these same effects more concentrated in this part of Canada, or does it just affect the rest of the globe, if that makes sense?
Uh, I'm not sure. I
Yeah,
do think fire is becoming more of a global phenomena. I mean, the smoke from fires, once it's in the atmosphere, it can circle the globe several times.
yeah,
You'll see that smoke from one country will impact another country. Um, that was happening last year for sure. Um, the smoke can land in like glacial deposits, and you can see
yeah,
signals from a large fire in one part of the world in another part of the world. If you're looking in like more like doing like cores out of
yeah.
glaciers or the soil, you can see signals from fires that didn't even occur in that jurisdiction. So, the other thing that I noticed in some recent fire seasons is smoke does an interesting thing in that it creates this insulating layer. It can reduce temperatures on the surface of the earth.
Hmm.
It can increase humidity slightly. It shades things out.
Hmm.
And from a real practical perspective, I've seen it where, in conducting prescribed fire, if you get a cloud pass over and you're just on the edge of conditions that are conducive to getting that fire to burn, it just takes a cloud to pass over, and all of a sudden you can lose the column on the fire, and the
Hmm.
fire behavior becomes subdued, and you might actually have a challenge getting the fire back up and burning again the way you want it to. So when you get these big fire seasons that blanket huge areas with smoke.
Hmm.
I recall a recent fire season in Alberta where we were on edge. Like the hair on the back of our neck was up, and we're thinking, "Oh my goodness, could be a bad year." And then, yeah, I think it was. I want to say it was 20. It was either 2018 or 2021. BC
Hmm.
sent a bunch of smoke across Canada,
Hmm.
and it blanketed Alberta. And we got through that period with kind of typical fire
Wow.
behavior in Alberta. And so again, I think, fire activity in one region can start to influence what's going on in another region. And I think these larger scale interactions are not well understood. These are things I've kind of
Hmm.
observed, but
Yeah.
I can't confirm scientifically. But I do think there are large connections that we're going to start to see more and more of as fire becomes more of a global phenomena. And so, yeah, to answer your question, yeah, I
Yeah.
think there are some of these kind of connection points at a larger scale, but maybe more for us to learn.
Yeah. To think that there are benefits of smoke, like I wouldn't have even thought about that because obviously, from a human health standpoint, it's been terrible the last few years, right? We have two young kids. I don't know if you have any kids, but it's just, you're so anxious to go outside in the summer and you can't because, of all the air quality advisories. But to think from a wildfire perspective, we don't, like you said, it's not well understood, but maybe there could be some positive benefits at times.
Yeah, smoke's going to be a big thing. Like whether you're directly impacted by a fire or not, you will be impacted by the smoke. And it's a
Yeah,
thing that I have kids as well. And it's, oh, we'd like to go biking today. We can't, we're going to have to stay inside kind of thing. And
yeah,
these are the real impacts that large portions of society are going to be facing going forward. And yeah, I like to see blue skies just like everyone else.
yeah. I think that's, I mean, I think that's often the comments you hear, like the health impacts is what maybe is going to force us as a society to change. Like, um, all the smoke that blanketed northeastern United States last year from the wildfires on the Atlantic Canada, like we were in you were in American news. We're often not American news, but it affected their skies, so we were in American news, right? Like it, people take notice of what's happening at that point. But yeah, smoke is definitely a big factor.
Yeah.
When it comes to wildfire management, just thinking about, I know you said it's not really one technology. We talked about the aircraft, and we often people think, oh, that's really the main thing that can really reduce wildfires. But just wanted to pick your brain on some other pieces. Something that's been on my mind for a long time is cloud seeding. Just trying to
Mm.
understand, is there a role for cloud seeding? The Chinese are very well known for using cloud seeding, like back in the 2008 Olympics to clear up their skies. But just wondering, and I think in Texas they use cloud seeding quite a bit. I could be wrong about that. There's no. It sounds like there's no silver bullet, but do we leverage cloud seeding in any way? Can it be a practical tool from a wildfire management standpoint? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't currently. I'm not aware
Mm,
of any fire agency in Canada that uses it. I have heard of historical trials, tests for it.
mm,
Um, I think at its core, you start to get into some ethical conversations around should we be changing the weather? Is it our role to change the weather? But just to back out a little bit on this question, there's um, a couple applications that could be used from a cloud seeding perspective. One is to dissipate the electrical charge in a weather system that's coming in that could bring lightning. And
mm,
so if you can dissipate that electrical charge, you could prevent the lightning strikes that could cause those new fires. And so
mm,
that could be one application of cloud seeding. Another, though, is by adding essentially the technical term would be a condensation nuclei, but essentially just small little particles to a cloud. It can speed up the process of condensation, which creates rain droplets
yeah.
and gets that cloud to start to rain. And so another potential application could be, well, can we influence where that cloud rains? And can we
Mm,
get it to rain so that we can improve the moisture conditions? Because sometimes clouds just pass over and you don't get any rain from them. So
yeah.
um, you know, those are two very applicable maybe applications of cloud seeding. Yeah, I'm not aware of any fire agency that's currently using it for those two reasons, but I think it could possibly be a solution going into the future that could be a new approach. Um, would require extensive trials, and again, I think it's going to start to come into some ethical space around like, okay, well, you're bringing rain over here or you're reducing lightning for fire, but how is that impacting my agricultural operation or the trees that we're trying to grow, right? It's like, uh, it's a tricky space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it sounds like we're not even quite exploring this just yet. Like you don't know of any trials that are being run in Canada on cloud seeding.
I don't know of any actual trials. I do know of some innovative firms that are investigating it right now.
Yeah,
So yeah, I think it is. I think it's an option that's starting to get looked at more closely, but I'm not aware of any operational trials that are occurring right now.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, we're already at a hour 10 here, Neil. It's been flying by. Any major takeaways you want folks to have from, whether it be from the predictions for this year or from the wildfire management aspect? You talked about some of the takeaways from the climate thing, but just in summary, anything that you want folks to really take away with going into this wildfire season?
Um, I would say a couple things. social media is a real thing these days, and there's
Mm.
all sorts of ways of getting information. And when we get into emergency situations, there's often uh, increased heightened need to seek out what's going on, what's happening,
Yeah.
how's it going to impact me, and some of these ways are easier to access than others. But I would just really encourage folks to be careful where you seek your information, and that emergencies are rapidly evolving, and look for trusted sources of information, whether that be the BC Wildfire Service where I work, or your
Hmm.
municipal fire authorities, or community authorities, emergency response agencies that are involved. Um, so that would be one thing. And what I really wanted to say with this is too much information can be no information.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so you're in a position where you got to sift through. And so also be cautious of what you're sharing through these
Yeah.
channels, and that other people might be looking at it, and you can quickly mislead folks. And I think at the core of what I'm trying to say, it's really important that we share accurate, factual information, and good, sound direction in these rapidly evolving emergency situations. Safety of the public and our staff is paramount, and we really want to ensure good outcomes. And so, just an emphasis on where you get your information. And I think a second thing would just be preparedness.
Hmm.
We're always preparing as fire organizations, but I challenge everyone that's listening, what's one thing that you've done to prepare for the upcoming fire season? And if you're scratching your head asking, well, how would I prepare? Go look at Fire Smart Canada, or go talk to
Mm.
your local agency on things that you can do. Something as simple as knowing what you would put in the suitcase or in that box if
Yep.
you had to leave in 30 minutes can go a long way in being prepared, and knowing where you would go. Um, Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Those are great.
It,
Yeah.
it's probably going to be another challenging season for many places in Canada, and we're probably going to see smoke in the sky. I think the last thing is, we're living in a human system, and so be kind to each other. We're very cognizant of mental health and well-being in our workforce. We're cognizant of the impacts that these challenging fire seasons have on members of the public from a mental health and well-being perspective as well. And so, just helping your neighbor out, and being cognizant that we're working in a very complex human system, and we're going to get through it together.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are fantastic takeaways. You've been working, you said 20 plus years in this business. What do you love about your job?
Oh, well, I mentioned the firebug earlier. I caught
Yeah.
it
Right.
earlier in my career. To
Yeah.
be honest, I never expected to pursue a career in fire. I took conservation biology, and I kind of had a different path in mind, but gained some fire experience early in my career, and it ended up being something that was on my resume, and I got offered a position 20 years ago to work in Alberta Wildfire to validate their fuel grid, and here I am now. And so I kind of caught that fire bug. It's you know we call it a natural disaster or a natural hazard, but at the same time, it's an incredible phenomenon to be experiencing and observing. Every time I've been out, whether it's a large fire or a small fire, um, we've all sat around a campfire and stared at the
Yeah.
flames and watched how they lick around a log and glow the glowing embers. It's
Hmm.
this fascinating phenomenon, and when you get to see that on a landscape scale, it's actually quite magical. And being able to better understand that and be able to provide predictive information to a large organization, to help provide direction to over 1,000 firefighting resources is actually quite special.
Mm.
So that's what I love about it. It's a very dynamic work environment. You have to be on your toes. No 2 days are the same. So I like the variety. I like the challenge. And I think the last thing, and we talked about in this interview, is there's this incredible opportunity to innovate, to
Yeah.
bring new technologies, to bring new approaches to an ever evolving fire regime and climate, and to do that on behalf of the public, on behalf of society, to keep people safe, to bring change to our forested landscapes so they're more resilient and we have healthy ecosystems going forward. It actually goes back to the core where I started of being a conservation biologist.
Mm,
To have a bit of influence on maybe helping solve this climate change conundrum we're in
yep.
and to ensure healthy ecosystems going forward is very meaningful to me. That's what I'm
Hmm.
all about. Yeah.
Yeah. BC's got to use you in some sort of promo video, Neil, to track some resources, because that was such a passionate answer. And yeah, it's really it's fantastic to know that there are people like you who, I know this about the public service in general. They're obviously very committed, dedicated folks to various different areas of the public service, but to know that you still remain committed and as passionate as ever, that's awesome to see. I have two questions I ask every guest. Are you okay if I shift to those, and then we'll
Absolutely.
call it a conversation? So our five for dinner question: dead or alive, who are five people you'd want to have supper with?
Yeah, you gave me this question ahead of time, and this is probably the hardest question to prepare for. Uh,
That's why I try to give it ahead of time. I've caught a few people off guard, and I hate that. So I'm glad you took a look at it.
so, I'll start by saying this. Obviously, I work pretty long hours during the fire season, and I'm often eating my dinner while I'm working.
Mm,
And then I have three children, and so when I'm not at work, we're constantly running kids around, and
yeah,
so
yeah.
just actually being able to sit down and have dinner with five people would be a gift. um, I have maybe two or three approaches to who I might invite. One would be, I think it'd be really neat to just actually sit down and have dinner with my family. So my
Mm,
mom, my dad, and my sister, like,
nice.
did that when I grew up.
Yeah,
Um, but when we've gotten together, over the last couple of years, it's with our partners and our
yeah,
kids,
yeah.
and it's not the same. So I think it would be really neat as adults to like just get together and have like this family dinner.
Oh, that's sweet.
And I might invite, if I could, my paternal grandmother, who I never got to
Yeah,
meet. She died
yeah,
before I met
yeah,
her, so um, that would be kind of neat to get to know her in that family setting. So that would be one option.
yeah. Are your
Option
parents still around?
They are, yeah,
Okay, that's
yeah.
good. Yeah, so that could totally happen then.
Totally happen.
Yeah.
Option two would just be friends. Like there's some incredible people that I've met in particularly going back to my university years.
Mhm.
I was working in our Jasper National Park and
Mhm.
met some people from across Canada. I also have some really good friends that go back to like elementary school, and they don't live in BC. They live,
Mm.
some of them now live in the States, some of them live in
Mhm.
other provinces, and I don't get to see them. I'd love to like get together with some of those friends and have dinner with them. That would be great. That'd be option two.
Yeah.
And if I were to kind of go like the celebrity route, I actually can't name five, but I I'm a musician and I love guitar, and so would love to sit down and actually just have a one-on-one with John Mayer.
Oh, wow.
I,
Yeah.
I really really follow his music. I think that'd
Mm.
be fun. Or some comedians. Like my
Mm.
job's pretty serious. Laughing is great
Yeah.
medicine. Maybe like
Yeah.
Jim Carrey and
Yeah.
Will Ferrell and
Yeah.
Adam Sandler. I don't know.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
list a couple comedians, but like just to have some
Just lighten it up.
sore abs and tears running down my
Yeah.
face and not even eat my dinner, but come away feeling great. I think
Yeah.
any of those three options for a dinner with five people would be great.
That's cool. Awesome five. Totally awesome five. Last question. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
What do I know for sure? I think what's important in life: family, our freedom,
Hmm.
and our health.
Yeah.
And these are the values that I have. And I think, as I look at current events around the globe, we're very fortunate in Canada to have those three things, and many people have those things being threatened right now. And so I know for sure those are my values, and I know those are the things that I want to fight for and promote in my family.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Neil, I came to this episode. I was like, maybe there's a little bit of hope for 2024 and what the season's going to look like. It's okay. You broke the news. That based on these higher drought risks, it might not look that great for Western Canada, particularly in BC. But it was really cool just to understand the thinking and how you folks approach the work from a predictive services and forecasting standpoint to how you're thinking about incorporating various technologies and what the future might look like in that field to managing wildfires and all the different considerations and operationally the challenges that we saw in 2023 and that sort of cross Canada approach and how we think about resourcing. That was really neat. To just speaking very frankly about climate change and how we're going to need to approach this from a societal aspect, but also just even from a prevention standpoint, some of the uh, adaptation pieces that we could consider a little bit more seriously and thinking about how do we prepare for wildfires, and we really need to seriously think about that. So I'm sure folks got a lot that they out of this episode, so really appreciate your time. You're welcome back anytime. I would love to connect with you again next year to sort of have another go at this, but yeah, really appreciate your time today and hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the invite, Rupesh. Really enjoyed chatting with you today. And you know what? We could get some rain this spring. Everybody do their
Oh,
rain
good,
dance.
good.
A good soaker in May and June
Yeah,
could just slow it down a little bit. And
yeah.
here's hoping. But hope's not a plan. Know that we've got some good staff out there that are prepared for whatever is going to come. And so yeah, thanks again. Great chatting with you, and happy to do it again.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. Really enjoy this conversation. Like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things, and we'll see you on the next one.